financial services industry is calling on both sides of politics here to commit to an economic growth agenda, or for more, and perhaps reform that is required. Blake Briggs joins us from the Financial Services Council. Blake, good to see you again.
Thank you for having me on the show.
And this, of course, as we head towards the federal election, so presumably we are going to hear some policies on both sides of politics. But how do you see the Australian economy at the moment, the way it is travelling, and why perhaps you see the need for reform?
So the Australian economy is in a clear malaise at the moment. GDP growth in the last reported quarter was 0.8%. And if it wasn't for state and government spending in the public sector, we would be in a recession at this point. So we're calling on both sides of politics to commit to both an economic growth agenda and also a deregulation agenda to get that private sector-led economic recovery going.
All right, let's take a look at the economic growth side of that then. How do you stimulate it?
So there are some really important policies the government can look at. The big one that changes the dial is tax reform. And so for our part, as an industry association, we're trying to keep all options on the table so that we can have a mature economic debate around what tax reform would be sensible and get away from some of the tinkering that we've seen in superannuation and other areas.
Well, I mean, this has been called for years, though, and it would appear both sides, dare I say, have been gutless. Because, well, look, it also comes back to that political cycle, isn't it?
It does.
You only got 3 years to actually make
It's very
an impression.
hard. Yep. The difference this time around, sorry to interrupt, is we do have a likely scenario where there could be a hung parliament, and the Teals are likely to have the balance of power. And they've put front and centre as one of the things that they expect to see from whoever forms government is a genuine tax reform process. And so industries like ours have a role to play in making sure that debate has space to occur.
Ideally, what sort of reform are you looking for?
Well, the big picture here is that the Australian company tax rate at 30% is uncompetitive with the OECD average, which is moving towards 20%. But if you want to be able to fund some of those reform proposals and change Australia's tax mix, then we need to keep all the options on the table. And we, as a representative of the superannuation sector, are mature enough to say that's appropriate.
Would you touch the GST?
I think GST needs to be part of that discussion.
Yeah, and I guess this also comes obviously with the new Trump presidency, and of course he's looking to slash taxes even further.
That's right. If we want Australia to be competitive with the US as well as other sources of global capital, then we need to keep looking at this option.
Now, another frustration for the economy, certainly for the Reserve Bank, the government has mentioned this too, of course, is the productivity or lack of it. How do you address that?
Well, I think we've even got the chair of ASIC, Joe Longo, saying regulation is complex in Australia. We don't do regulatory simplicity well. And so we've put forward 9 different policy priorities to simplify regulation on the financial services sector. The reality is that whilst the Financial Services Royal Commission was an important way of protecting consumers, a lot of the regulation that came out of that was designed in Canberra in haste. And we're seeing the overhang of complex and unwieldy policies that came out of that. And so what we're calling for is revisiting some of those design principles, looking at where it went too far and doesn't add any consumer benefit, and cutting back the cost of business compliance having to keep up with those changes.
You have put perhaps a potential cost on it in terms of, you're saying reform and deregulation could potentially deliver some $2 billion in financial services exports, an extra $1.7 billion in economic growth, $800 million a year in the sector's productivity. How have you come up with those numbers?
That's right. So we commissioned a group called Positive Economics to do the research and the modelling behind this. The deregulation agenda would cut about $800 million a year in costs for the sector and obviously support growth and lower fees for consumers. The export component and the economic growth component would bring $2 billion a year in GDP growth. And so both of those together are very powerful levers for the government to play. Obviously, with the financial services sector as one of the biggest sectors in the Australian economy, it's something that needs to be taken seriously.
All right, so you're essentially calling for a red tape razor gang. Has echoes, dare I say, of Donald Trump's Doge committee in the States, doesn't it?
Look, I'm not so far as to say that Doge seems to be indiscriminate cutting wherever the political winds take it. We're much more focused on good policy. So what we want to look at is, where has the regulatory pendulum swung too far? Where has poor design cost businesses in ways that don't bring any consumer benefits? And making sure that there are people within Canberra who are tasked and accountable for finding those efficiencies to get the private sector going again.
And Blake, what role does the financial services industry have to play in achieving that sustainable economic growth?
Well, first of all, we need to come forward with concrete policy proposals. It's really easy for the business community to be seen as just complaining about, oh, it's too hard and red tape holds us back. We actually need to be able to put on the table tangible policy recommendations. And so that's what we've done. We've gone out early to be able to say, when we talk about growing the economy, this is what it means in the financial services context. I think there are opportunities for all other sectors of the economy to do a similar exercise, so that whoever forms government after the next election has a really clear roadmap to get the economy going.